Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with The Guardian's deputy political editor, Jessica Elgot, and The Times' Home Affairs editor, Matt Dathan. Welcome to both of you. So let's take a look at the front pages then, shall we? Starting with the Metro. It calls energy companies who have been using forcible entry power crazy. The Eye has been told by the Magistrates Association that it may be necessary to change the law to achieve lasting fairness for customers. And the Daily Star has some less than flattering things to say about certain energy bosses. Well, The Guardian has word of renewed calls for a windfall tax on oil firms after Shell reported profits of more than £32 billion. The Daily Mail carries details of Sky News' interview with the family of missing mother of two, Nicola Bulley. Their headline, "People don't just vanish into thin air." Charges dropped is the headline for the Daily Mirror as it reports that footballer Mason Greenwood won't face trial. According to the Financial Times, European bond markets have responded well to today's interest rate rises from key central banks, including the Bank of England, apparently confident that they won't be going much higher. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So go straight to our guests then, Jessica Elgot and Matt Dathan. Jessica, I know The Guardian, The Eye and now The Times have all done stuff on prepayment, haven't they? There's been outrage in the industry, not least from Centrica, which owns British Gas, about what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that outrage will ring quite hollow for the people who have had, the name British Gas hollered at their door, and then people forcing their way inside to fit prepayment meters. And Graham Stewart, the energy minister, who met the chief executive of Centrica, which owned British Gas, today, and also the head of Ofgem, which is the watchdog, has basically said. Ofgem has basically said now that all suppliers mustn't do this anymore until there's a major review. Some of the stuff that's been revealed, particularly by the Times, about the use of prepayment meters is astonishing and really, really disturbing, forcing their way into houses where there are young children and babies, people with disabilities living there, and all very much against the regulations.
Absolutely. Going into homes where they see an older person and saying, oh, we've got an easy day. I mean, it's really astonishing that anybody can break into anybody's homes. And the whole point of this, Matt, is that prepayment meters were supposed to be a last resort and not in vulnerable people's homes. So, who has allowed this to happen? Should there be a real inquiry into this now?
Absolutely. I mean, Centrica, who owns British Gas, have announced an internal inquiry today. But I think there's going to be more and more pressure over the next few days from MPs to call on the government really to launch an independent inquiry into practices by firms. And Ofgem today have ordered all energy companies to stop this practice. But what strikes me is that Grant Shapps has last month ordered a crackdown on this to stop. He ordered companies to stop force-fitting prepayment meters on vulnerable customers, and yet this practice still went on at the same time as that crackdown. Times reporter Paul Morgan Bentley was actually undercover during that announcement, and they continued to carry out these practices. It just shows you that the government can announce all it wants, but actually sometimes public interest journalism is much more powerful.
Well, indeed, yeah. The Times saying the boss of British Gas's parent company, Centrica, said he was really, truly sorry. Rishi Sunak said he was deeply shocked and concerned. The Financial Conduct Authority said it was closely reviewing practices at Arvato Financial Solutions, the service used by British Gas to collect debt. Meantime, The Eye talks about the Magistrates Association suggesting there may be a case for reviewing the law as concerns about court warrants to allow these forced entry, approved, they say, amid secrecy and without full scrutiny, Jessica.
I think that's a really, a big question mark over this, and something that MPs should certainly be turning their attention to. But all of these entries were using court warrants that have been obtained from magistrates. And the way it's described in many of the pieces is that magistrates are just kind of given a list by companies. It's done over the phone. There's very little scrutiny. Now, I'm not that familiar exactly with how the process works, but there's if there's no checks on vulnerability at all. There's no requirement for the companies to present evidence apart from just their own word for it that these customers are not vulnerable and that this is a last resort. Then there clearly needs to be a different system in place, because as soon as people hear someone's at their front door with a court warrant, then obviously that's very, very scary and very sinister for them, and often that's the case. That each time I suspect it is the case that they're there legally with these court warrants, but you're wondering how they've been obtained and what's been said in order to obtain them.
And Matt, the Metro, picking apart what's been happening with those British Gas prepayment issues, and what's happened at Shell, revealing profits which had doubled to £32.2 billion. And in fact, their core profits were $84.3 billion, going back to dollars now. But after tax, etc., obviously they came down to the figure I quoted of about $40 billion. I mean, extraordinary numbers. And many people have said, oh, there we are, there you need a windfall tax. But the point is, of course, that you can't tax profits that are not made in the UK. So this becomes a more complicated argument, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And you just have to look at the comparison with Europe. I think Shell paid tax of about $134 million compared to about $530 million in Europe. So you just go to show the differences there. But I think it's going to again come back to politics. This question of whether companies making such huge profits at the same time as households are struggling with their bills should face a higher windfall tax. And Labour are already seizing upon this, and Ed Miliband demanding that the government adopt Labour's policy of a 35% tax rather than the current 25% tax. But it's also just terrible timing, I think, given that in April, just a couple of months away, energy bills are going to rocket to an estimated £3,000, and when that support package ends as well from the government. So it's an all-round very sort of bad timing. And it'd be interesting to see if Shell comes out and offers possibly its more vulnerable customers greater help itself.
Yes, indeed, your figures were right there. Shell said it was due to pay $134 million through the UK windfall tax for 2022. It expects to pay more than $500 million due to the levy this year, and stressing that it actually paid $1.9 billion or £1.5 billion in total tax charges to the UK and EU last year. But Labour said Mr Sunak was too weak, the word we always hear at PMQs, to stand up to oil and gas interests. Ed Miliband, suggesting as the British people face an energy price hike of 40% in April, the government is letting fossil fuel companies off the hook. The Lib Dems, Ed Davey, no company should be making these kind of outrageous profits out of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So what's wrong with the windfall tax as it has been set up by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor then, Jessica?
Well, I think, ultimately that Sunak did introduce a windfall tax, and that was toughened by Jeremy Hunt. It went up in the last statement, and now it's but if people will look at the numbers that you've both been quoting, it will seem very much like there's a big disparity between the amount of tax it's paying and the amount of bumper profits that it's posting. And even Sunak's spokesman today, to journalists, acknowledged that the public would see these profits as extraordinary, and said that was why they'd introduced the windfall tax, and they say that strikes a balance between encouraging these companies to invest, and particularly to invest in making sure that you have sort of better energy security, but also to kind of support jobs or etc. But also acknowledging these are very extraordinary profits. Labour obviously say that they would go further and tax these profits more, even more, because they are essentially profiteering from what is a very difficult situation globally, and especially affected by the war in Ukraine.
Matt, the Financial Times also has it on the front page as well. Shell made a record annual profit of almost $40 billion, it says, after a tumultuous year in energy markets. Certainly questions about where they're getting the liquid natural gas from as well. Shell said it had paid $13 billion in tax worldwide in 2022, but only $100 million in the UK. So this is a conundrum, isn't it, for Rishi Sunak? There seems no appetite for a tightening of the windfall rules again, or further windfall taxes from this government.
No, I think a lot of Tory MPs would warn against hitting businesses even harder, because of investment in energy resources in the UK is so important for reducing our reliance abroad, especially given the war in Russia. But and I guess the argument against hitting them even harder is that, along with corporation tax and the 10% supplementary tax, their total tax liability is about 75%, although they can sort of reduce their tax burden by with losses and decommissioning North Sea oil platforms, etc. So I guess it's a hard argument to make against increasing windfall taxes on energy firms, and especially when I guess the argument would be, let's hit Shell and not other companies. I think it'd be very tricky at the budget, but you've also got to factor in that Tory MPs hate any kind of tax rises, including those against businesses, and Tory MPs are clamouring for tax cuts. So anything that's going to increase Britain's tax burden is going to be very unpopular on the Tory benches.
Also on the front page of the Financial Times, Jessica, the interest rate decision that we had today and elsewhere, it points out as well, with the Federal Reserve the night before. So 4%, possibly the peak. What do you reckon?
Yes, I mean, so the 4% is pretty much what was expected, but is going to pile pressure again on mortgages and businesses who've taken out loans, and they say that it's particularly needed because of wage rises in the private sector, and that hadn't been forecast. But I think that there's some room for optimism in some of the stuff that the Bank of England was saying today, suggesting that it would be a shallower recession than anticipated, and that inflation is probably peaking now, and that we won't, we'll sort of see a recession that doesn't go quite as badly as had previously been predicted. So there may well still be this very similar long-running effects, but essentially what they're saying is they're coming faster than expected, and therefore the effects, therefore we might get through this period quicker.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating, wasn't it, to hear their assessment of why they were making the decision and their prognosis, if you like, for the UK economy, Matt. For example, that any recession we have, technical or whatever, will be shallower, possibly, and shorter. And this idea of what will cause inflation to continue, well, very clearly they said prices and wages is what will extend inflation beyond predicted. Now, you wonder who that's aimed at during this strike action that we've seen, but very interesting to hear the governor then.
Yes, I'm sure the Treasury will jump on his remarks about the danger of offering much higher pay increases for public sector workers, and I guess the broader private sector as well, because that is one of the biggest drivers of inflation, along with fuel and energy. But what was really interesting from Andrew Bailey for me today was his analysis that the COVID pandemic had a much longer term effect on the economy, particularly in terms of the labour market, and the number of people choosing not to participate. So mainly those nearing retirement age who chose to retire during or just after the pandemic. And we've heard a lot from Jeremy Hunt as well, and the Work and Pension Secretary Mel Stride about this real need to try and get people in their 50s and 60s who have retired back into work. And I think that's going to be a real theme at the budget next month. But it's just interesting that Andrew Bailey is really also sending out that public message today.
Yeah, I mean, he said the significant and lingering fall in labour supply weighs on our economic potential, suggesting this marked rise in inactivity by 50 to 65-year-olds was partly choice and long-term illness. Now, we know some of that is mental health illness. One wonders how much of it is COVID as well, still, or long COVID for some people. And certainly Mel Stride, Jessica, says he has been tasked by Rishi Sunak with trying to tempt people back. It'd be fascinating to see how possible that is.
Yeah, and I know this is something as well that Labour are also trying to develop policies around. It's something that's really kind of baffling people to see this extent of inactivity, particularly in the over 50s. People just kind of checking out of the workforce. A lot of the time it is, and so much of it seems to be down to mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and long COVID is again kind of quite difficult to track in some of those figures, but you know, how do we sort of persuade people to try and get back into work with flexible hours? Maybe giving them some rights for grandparental leave is one of the things that we've heard talked about. You know, if they're maybe deciding to give up work a bit earlier so that they can you know, look after, you know, help their children shoulder some of the cost of living crisis which is affecting them. You know, I think there's also a question mark about people who you know, found themselves on long-term sickness or benefits, and ways maybe we can get them back into work and then allow them to go, you know, if work doesn't really work out for them and they find it very difficult, allow them to go back on their benefits without going through a whole reassessment process, which is a thing that can put people off, you know, trying work out in the first place. And both Mel Strider and Labour have talked about that being as one kind of possible solution of maybe a gentler approach to encouraging people back into the workforce, you know, rather than kind of using the stick approach.
Yes, very interesting, isn't it? They might also have given up work to look after older parents if they can't get social care. There's, you know, so many facets of society playing into that now. Anyway, stay there, both of you. Lots more still to come, including why Afghan refugees are being told to leave the capital. We'll discuss that next. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, Jessica Elgot and Matt Dathan from The Guardian and The Times. Welcome back to both of you. Matt, let's go to The Guardian, shall we? Apologies, Jessica, and it's your paper. But hundreds of Afghan refugees who had settled in London after fleeing the Taliban, the paper tells us, have been told to uproot and move 200 miles away. So why is this?
It's quite a shocking story. It's because the ongoing practice of housing around 10,000 Afghan refugees in hotels. And these are people who haven't just come across the channel in the last few weeks. These are Afghan families who we evacuated from Kabul in August 2021, so 18 months ago, and they're still living in hotels. Local authorities can't find homes for them. The government can't move them out of hotels, and the hotel contracts obviously expire. And so we've heard a lot of examples of families being moved across the country, but this one is extremely worrying because it's 200 miles away, Kensington to Wetherby in Yorkshire, and it concerns 150 children. So it just shows you the disruption that these Afghan families are facing after fleeing the Taliban a year and a half ago in the UK.
But people listening to this at home, Jessica, would probably suggest that it doesn't make any sense to house them in one of the most expensive parts of the UK, you know, Kensington in West London, that in fact actually more of a community feel might be found for them elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think then the question is, why can't you settle people in the first place, in the place where they can try and start to put down roots and send their children to school and find jobs, which is what these refugees have found where they were initially put. And it's not their fault that that's where they've were initially told they would be living. And Wetherby's pretty familiar to me, which is the town where they've been told they're going to be sent, because it's very close to where I grew up. And it's a beautiful town. It's a lovely place to live, but it's small and it doesn't have a train station, and it's probably it's a long time, maybe an hour on the bus to Leeds. And so therefore, finding school places, finding jobs, moving somewhere like that is not easy. It's not a place where necessarily some of the skills that some of these refugees have, and some of them have had very skilled jobs before, are necessarily going to be the place where they can find them. So I think that's there's no disrespect to Wetherby as a place. It's a wonderful place to live, but I think there are reasons why it might not be the most suitable place to move them.
Jessica, Matt, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. Both with us through the 11, but let's take a look now at the weather.